Star Trek's pilot episode started a negative trend that took over 50 years to break the original pilot of Star Trek. The original series began an unfortunate Star Trek trope that took the franchise more than 50 years to fix. Before Captain James T. Kirk William Shatner took over as commander of the USS Enterprise, Captain Christopher Pike, Jeffrey Hunter, was in command of the iconic ship. In The Cage, Pike and his crew traveled to Talos 4, where they encountered an incredibly advanced race of aliens who could manipulate thought. The Talosians tried to convince Pike to stay, tempting him with an attractive woman. For her part, Vina, Susan Oliver, did begin to develop feelings for Pike, and he for her, despite the interference from the Talosians. As the Talosians, Star Trek's first villains, tried to determine what kind of woman Pike wanted, they presented Vina to him in several different guises, creating realistic illusions that felt real to Pike. In the first scenario, Vina was a Rigelian princess who needed rescuing from barbarians. In the second, she was a simple farm girl from Earth, and in the last, she was a green-skinned Orion slave girl who danced seductively for Pike. It's this latter disguise that created a recurring problem for Star Trek. The depiction of Vina as an Orion slave girl is problematic for several reasons, and illustrates one of the most outdated aspects of Star Trek, the original series. While TOS was progressive in many ways, the casual sexism sprinkled throughout the show places it firmly in the 1960s. The Orion slave girl unfortunately became a bit of a trope, and subsequent depictions of Orions did not fare much better. Another Orion woman named Marta, Yvonne Craig, makes an appearance in TOS Season 3, Episode 16, Whom Gods Destroy. As a patient in a mental institution like Vina, as an Orion, Marta wears very little clothing, dances seductively, and tries to seduce the men around her. While there is nothing wrong with a woman who owns her sexuality, making these Orion women slaves or prisoners takes away any agency they may have had. The Orions received very little development as a species on TOS, and they became most known for their dancing green slave women. In The Cage, Captain Pike falls for Vina as herself, but even he is tempted by her Orion dance, which is not a great look for the Enterprise captain. Although Star Trek, Enterprise tried to update the Orions for a modern audience, their version of the alien society was only marginally better than what was depicted in Star Trek, the original series. It was not until Star Trek Lower Decks that the franchise finally introduced three-dimensional Orion characters who were more than pirates and slavers. With her infectious enthusiasm for Starfleet and scientific discovery, Lt. Devanna Tendi, Noelle Wells, is a breath of fresh air among the crew of the USS Cerritos. She defies her past as an Orion pirate, even as she sometimes uses the skills it taught her. As one of the few Orions in Starfleet, Tendi has fought to change the perceptions many have of her species, and her stories on Lower Decks have single-handedly redefined the Orions. Tendi's relationship with her sister, Darika, Ariel Winter, in particular, is one of Star Trek's strongest sibling relationships, despite only being featured in a few scenes. Star Trek Lower Decks leans into the hilarity of the Cerritos crew's antics, but the show has helped bring Trek canon into the modern era, and it can be serious and heartwarming when it wants to be. The original Star Trek series, created by Gene Roddenberry, holds a cherished place in television history for its bold vision of the future and its deep impact on science fiction storytelling. However, its pilot episode, The Cage, introduced a problematic trend that shaped not just Star Trek, but many other science fiction series for decades: the overwhelming focus on white male protagonists and the marginalization of diversity in the central cast. It took more than 50 years for this trend to be significantly addressed in the Star Trek universe, a shift that reflects broader changes in society and television. In The Cage, Captain Christopher Pike, played by Jeffrey Hunter, was the main protagonist, leading a crew dominated by white male officers. While it did feature a strong female character, Number 1, played by Majel Barrett, her role was minimized, and she was ultimately written out of the show when the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, was produced. This episode solidified the casting of a white male lead, William Shatner, as Captain James T. Kirk, and the rest of the cast fit the same mold, with a few exceptions. While Star Trek was groundbreaking in many ways, such as its inclusion of Uhura, one of the first African-American characters in a non-menial role on American television, the focus remained on white male heroism. The groundbreaking elements of the show were often overshadowed by the continued prioritization of white male characters as the central figures, a trend that would become ingrained in not just Star Trek, but in much of American television and film. This wasn't merely an issue of representation, but also of narrative focus. White male leads were consistently portrayed as the ones making the crucial decisions, solving problems, and driving the action. Other characters, especially women and people of color, were often relegated to supporting roles that rarely allowed them to be more than mere satellites orbiting the male protagonist. While characters like Spock and Uhura were memorable and important, they were seldom allowed to take center stage in a way that could rival Kirk's dominance. For over 50 years, this trend persisted, not only in Star Trek but across much of the science fiction genre. The idea of the heroic white male captain became almost synonymous with the genre's identity, from shows like Battlestar Galactica to Stargate SG-1. It reflected societal norms and prejudices of the time, wherein diversity was seen as secondary to a traditional view of leadership and heroism. However, the tide began to turn in the 21st century, especially as audiences became more vocal about the lack of representation in media. Social movements like #OscarsOhite and the broader calls for diversity in Hollywood fueled the conversation about who gets to be the hero, and the entertainment industry slowly started to respond. Star Trek began its own transformation with Star Trek Discovery, which premiered in 2017. This series broke from the franchise's long-held tradition by centering its story around a black woman, Michael Burnham, played by Sonequa Martin Green. Burnham's character was complex, intelligent, and capable, a marked departure from the sidelined roles women of color had traditionally occupied in earlier installments of the series. In many ways, Discovery represents a rejection of the negative trend that began with The Cage. It not only features a diverse cast, but actively embraces themes of inclusion and representation. Burnham is not merely a supporting character to a male captain, and she is the driving force behind the narrative, and the series focuses on her emotional and professional journey. In addition to Burnham, Discovery has introduced a wide range of characters who reflect the diversity of the world, including LGBTQ+ representation with characters like Paul Stamets, Anthony Rapp, and Hugh Culber, Wilson Cruz. This trend continued with Star Trek Picard, which, while bringing back Patrick Stewart as the beloved Captain Jean-Luc Picard, also introduced a much more diverse cast. The focus was no longer exclusively on a white male hero saving the day, but on a team of characters from different backgrounds working together, each contributing in meaningful ways to the story. The culmination of this shift arguably came with Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which revisits the era of Captain Pike, now played by Anson Mount, but significantly reimagines the crew's dynamics and diversity. The show honors Star Trek's legacy while correcting its historical shortcomings. In this iteration, characters of various ethnicities, genders, and orientations play vital roles in the narrative, with no single figure dominating the story. The cast includes women in positions of power, such as Number 1, Rebecca Romijn, and characters from various ethnic backgrounds, such as Lon Noonien Singh, Christina Chong. This new era of Star Trek embraces the ideals of inclusion that were always a part of Roddenberry's vision, but which were constrained by the cultural limitations of the 1960s. The fact that it took over half a century to fully realize these ideals on screen speaks to the depth of the trend established by The Cage,